Well, welcome everybody. Good morning to you. It's just great to spend some time with you again. And I just want to talk us through where we're going today. Let me read you some verses from Acts chapter 1. It says these words there. And while staying with them, Jesus ordered them not to depart from Jerusalem, but to wait for the promise of the Father, which he said, "You heard from me." A little bit later on it goes on. So when they had come together, they asked him, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" And then right at the start of Acts chapter 2, it says these words. When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. Over these last few weeks, we've sort of tried to build towards Pentecost Sunday, which is next week. And I know you're going to enjoy what Paul has to share next week, because I know it's very much been on his heart. And we've kind of just stepped through over these last 3 weeks. So you remember Chippo talked about getting our heart right so that we can hear God properly. The week before that, I had that little talk about Tag Your It, talking about us as the people of God, the church, are God's provision to a world that desperately needs authentic expressions of God's love through his people. And 3 weeks ago, Paul was talking and he used this phrase, in his dependence, talking about how it's important for us not to be independent, but actually resting on a partnership arrangement of working with God in his dependence. And this is just a gentle pathway that's taken us towards Pentecost Sunday. I just want to build on that before we arrive at Pentecost Sunday next week. Now, I wonder if there's any particularly parents out there or carers, and you've had your kids in the car going on a long journey somewhere, perhaps on a holiday, and about 10 minutes into the journey, a little voice will pipe up from the back seat, "Mummy, Daddy, are we there yet?" Anybody remember those phrases? I remember them all to this day. And as a rookie parent, I would say things like, "We're not far, darling. We'll soon be there. Not long now," because children have a real difficulty in understanding the concept of long times. And of course, that's when I was a learner parent. I would say those things. Inside, though, when you've heard that question for the 50th time, "Are we there yet?" The 50th time, normally in 13 minutes. You really want to say, "No, we're not really there yet. Actually, we've got a long way to go. We're going to be driving for hours and hours. And we'll probably, if you don't keep quiet, we'll end up driving like this for the rest of our lives together." I wouldn't say that, of course, but sometimes frustration can bubble up inside of us. That question, though, "Are we there yet?" is very much a part of the human condition. It's a part of our physical journey, but it's also part of our spiritual journey and a part of being God's people. We often have that question deep inside that says, "God, are you going to do your stuff yet? Are you going to help us out yet?" You can kind of see it in those verses in Acts chapter 1 when the disciples spoke to Jesus and they had this idea about what Jesus' victory would really look like. And they used the question, "So are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" In other words, is the military might of Israel in a very secular, very human sense going to be restored? And God had a much bigger plan that they weren't grasping. That question was a "Are we there yet, Jesus?" type of question. You know, we revisit that "Are we there yet?" question every week when we catch the news. We're waiting for the briefing from the Prime Minister's office about the scenario that we find ourselves in with COVID. Are we there yet? Are the churches going to be allowed to meet together yet? And if so, how many people are going to be able to gather together? Are we there yet? Are we out yet? Are we out of our homes yet? Are we able to go and visit our families yet? Can I hug my friends and my family yet? No, you can't, by the way. You can't do that. So please don't take that as an authority from me. Are we there yet? Drives us because we long to arrive at the end of a journey. When in those verses, I want you to understand or see that when Jesus spoke to the disciples to wait in Jerusalem, it uses quite a strong term. It says he ordered them to stay because he knows what his disciples are like. You know, when young children are getting excited about something and you need them to just sit still for a moment, that voice comes on you and says as a parent, "Now just wait a moment. Don't go anywhere." And you can see sometimes the reaction in a young child's eyes is looking around, looking for the moment to move ahead. And you know, the safest place in that moment is to wait and to trust the parent, to trust the mother or the father. It's almost that tone that Jesus says to his disciples, now don't go charging off, guys. I want you to wait, and you'll know when it's time to move. You'll know. That condition of impatience about trying to move ahead of what God wants to do in our lives, you can see in a story in the Old Testament when the children of Israel that have been enslaved for nearly 400 years by the Egyptian superpower of the day came to a point where they were about to be released from their captivity after all of these generations. They were an oppressed people. They were enslaved because of their ethnicity. Then God appears to this man, Moses, who was an escaped convict, really, an escaped murderer. God uses all kinds of people to bring about his purpose. And we read these words in Exodus chapter 3. It says, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I've now come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. There's a very personable God, a very immanent God involved in caring for his people, where he says, I'm going to lead you on a journey up out of Egypt to bring you to a land that is flowing with milk and honey. That's a metaphorical statement that says it's a land that will just provide all that you need. Simple journey. Shouldn't take that long. If you look at this map that I've got coming up on the screen in a moment, you'll see that on the green line there, it's just sort of east and north of where they were on the left-hand side of your screen, moving across to the right from Lower Egypt up towards the borders of Canaan as it was then. That's a journey of probably about 6 weeks, 42 days for a nation that size on foot. That's all it should have taken. A simple journey. But God had other plans. If you read on a bit further, it says this in Exodus, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was shorter. For God thought, if the people face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people by the roundabout way of the wilderness or the desert and toward the Red Sea. That's quite a strange journey, because if you look at this second map, if you follow the red line that follows that kind of journey, it goes down to the south, to the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula. Just picture with me for a moment what would have been going on in the minds of the children of Israel. There they were, just released from captivity, emancipated and free and burdened down with the gifts that the Egyptians gave them. Just look with me at this picture here. You'll see the children have been emancipated, released from captivity, and they see this pillar of cloud appear. Just would have been an awesome sight, perhaps something like this. I tell you, this is divine sat-nav at work right here. This divine navigation system. God is leading his children of Israel out of captivity. And they know where the promised land is. They've been told where they're going. And that's north and east. But the pillar of cloud heads south. And I wonder what was going through their minds. God, you're going the wrong way. Our destination is that way. And God says, I'm taking you on a roundabout way. There's a big question here that I'd like us just to think for a moment. Will people follow God when they don't understand God? Will we follow God when we don't understand God? For many of us, we find ourselves in confusing times, and we're trying to hang on to God and believing that he's in control. But if we're honest, we don't fully understand what's going on. Sure, we're finding some beauty in the journey, some incredible things are taking place in the name of our God. But actually in our heart, we're trying to understand, God, what is it you're really up to? Maybe we'll try and work it out. But even if we don't ever understand, will we follow him? We know about God's detours in our lives. You and I both know that God takes us on sort of roundabout journeys all the time. It's one of God's favourite things that he seems to want to do for his people. It's a part of our spiritual condition. And if we're really honest, it's one of the most annoying things about God, that he never seems to do what we expect him to do. It's very irritating at times. I don't know about you, but I have to be honest and say, God, sometimes you really have to make me struggle with my trust in you, and God is up to something. And that journey, by the way, that we saw on the map, That wasn't a minor detour. That should have taken 40 days. And you know the story. It took 40 years to do that roundabout journey. By the way, 40 is a very significant number in the Bible. God uses it often to make a point here. 40 is the number of years that Moses hid in the desert after he'd murdered the Egyptian overlord and fled for his life. 40 days was the length of time that Elijah fled for his life from the wicked queen Jezebel in Israel's history. He fled into the wilderness again, just like Moses in the Midian desert did. And actually, 40 days is the length of time that Jesus was pushed into the desert by the Holy Spirit. That's an interesting phrase that the New Testament writers use of Jesus. It almost seems to suggest that Jesus didn't want to go into the wilderness. He didn't want to go there. And so the Spirit of God pushed him into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted, to feel loneliness and hunger and thirst and have to face real temptations. And just pause for a moment. Let's not over-spiritualize Jesus' journey in the wilderness, in the desert. Those temptations were real. And he had to overcome those things that would appeal to his human self and put the devil in his place. Even as Christians, we'll avoid the reality of a wilderness experience. When the desert experiences come for no discernible reasons at all in our lives, we look for the ways of escape, the short journey along the northern part of that Sinai Peninsula. It was known actually, that journey for the children of Israel could have been the way of the sea, but it was also known as the way of the Philistines that would have put them into enemy territory. We look to avoid those difficult journeys to try to find shortcuts. But when those desert experiences come, and they will come, I want you to remember this. It doesn't mean that God has forgotten you. It doesn't mean that he's turned his back on you. He's using circumstances that you might classify as a desert experience as a way of strengthening you. And perhaps that's my first point I just want to sort of lay with you right now. The desert is where God makes you strong. Paul says in the New Testament, he's quoting what God said to him, "For my strength is made perfect in your weakness." Now, none of us wants to be thought of as being weak. And in our story, why would God lead his people on that roundabout kind of journey? The text actually says this, for God thought if people face war, challenge, difficulty, the Philistines, they might change their minds and go back to Egypt. We think, how would that even possible? But the heart of man can be desperately fickle and change its mind almost within the wind. And God says, I want to anchor your choices into the truth that you know about me. The direct route would have taken them past that enemy territory who were hostile. God was perfectly capable of delivering the children of Israel any one of a number of ways. It's just that they didn't believe that yet about God. They hadn't proved him as yet. They were too frightened. So God would lead them on a roundabout way so that day by day, week by week, year by year, he would develop in them the qualities of courage and faith and perseverance and tenacity and a deep love of their God. In other words, God is not nearly as concerned with where his people are going as who they will become on that journey. For 400 years, that nation of Israel had been slaves. And all that slavery stuff, that mentality, was inside of them still. And God wanted to take them on a new journey. It's so hard to trust when your land is milk and honey. When everything's going great. When everything's working out okay. When your prayers are getting answered. When your problems go away with just a bullet prayer. When your kids' teeth are all straight and clean and white and they don't argue about going to the dentist. And when your bank account is up and your weight is down and your hair looks great. I'm struggling with that right now. And you heard from Paul last week that he's on a similar journey to me right now. And the dog looks happy. Everything seems to be going great. It's hard to trust in those times because there's nothing to trust for. Often, I don't know about you, I've found this. When somebody first become a Christian, God seems to give them this amazing little gift where their desire for him is just immense. They want to read the Bible. I remember going through it. I remember experiencing this. I just wanted to tell my friends about Jesus. I had a tenacious appetite for the Bible. I wanted to read the Bible. It wasn't hard to pray. And I saw God do amazing things because I prayed. New Christians, that is often their story, their testimony. In the immediate term, there is this overwhelming ease with which they run in rhythm with the desires of God. Not even the old temptations look good anymore. Then over time, something strange begins to happen. And what was once easy and enjoyable in your spiritual life becomes difficult. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Maybe just put an emoji on YouTube, on the chat if you listen to me. Just put it up there. You pray, you try to pour your heart out towards God, but it feels like those prayers don't get past the ceiling. God isn't really interested. The Bible now looks kind of difficult to read and even confusing in certain places, perhaps troubling in certain areas. Temptations begin to look really appealing at times like this, and you feel just so dry. It's not that you're in a desert. It's like a desert has crept up inside of you. It's just dry. Maybe it's because you've been running after a sin that you should be turning your back on. You need to confess that with somebody and get it dealt with. But more often than not, these are circumstances that seem to touch our world unannounced. They descend for no discernible reason whatsoever. It's what a great Christian writer by the name of St. John of the Cross, he dubbed in his writings the dark night of the soul. But it's in those times that God can actually be at work. I remember when my son was about 3 years old, he was learning to ride his bike. He had a little green two-wheeler with the stabilizers on, and he was quite content to ride his bike with the stabilizers. But the day came when I knew it was time to take those stabilizers off. Now, I know what my son Joel's like. He doesn't like those changes very easily, and so he knew something was up, and he was asking me all kinds of questions as we were taking him to the park with his bike. Daddy, you take him a bike, and somehow he seemed to know about the stabilizers. You're not going to touch those stabilizers, Daddy. You're not going to touch those stabilizers. It's all right, darling. We'll be okay. And we got to the park, and because I had my sort of spanner, and I began to just remove the nuts. He said, "What are you doing, Daddy?" I said, "I'm just adjusting these stabilizers. Don't worry." He said, "You're not taking them off," and I just didn't answer him. Doesn't God do that with us sometimes? He just doesn't answer us. He just does some stuff, but he doesn't answer when we ask those very bold questions into his face. So I took those off. He says, "All right, Joel, I'm going to hold on to the back of your seat." He says, "Well, you won't let go. You won't let go." You see, I knew he was ready. He just didn't know he was ready. And so I can see him now. To this day, it's a vivid memory. We're at a place in West London called the Bunny Park in Ealing. And he was on his little legs began to sort of pump those pedals as fast. And I began to run alongside him. And I held on. You're not letting go, Daddy. I'm not letting go, son. I'm not letting go. And I ran with him. I could feel that he had the balance in that moment. And so I let go. And I ran with him. And he says, "You've not let go, Dad. You've not let go, Dad." And I said, "Look, Joel, I've let go. You're pedaling on your own." And in that moment, he got it. And off he went down the path. It was a joy. Just the downside for that for me, as I think about that, is what I did forget to do was to teach him where the brakes were. And off he went down the path. He was full of it then. He could cycle, turned off the path. Down the path was a grass verge. It was quite steep. I watched him pick up speed. Shock, horror filled my face. And there was a fallen tree at the bottom of that thing, and he went straight into it. Went, "Ha ha!" And I just saw the bike spin, and my little boy up into the air, over the other side, and my heart was in my mouth. Then up popped his head, ran round, picked up his bike, and he was away, undamaged and unharmed. So, yeah, I'm an earthly, carnal sort of failure of a parent here and there. God doesn't do that with us, but he does know when to take his hands off of our lives and say, "It's time for you to walk, to fly, to ride that bike of ministry and calling and destiny. My strength is made perfect in weakness." Don't think that if you're on a roundabout journey with God right now, that he's forgotten all about you. He hasn't. He may have taken the hands off the wheel of your saddle, but he's running alongside and he's cheering you along. He's saying, "Come on, you can achieve all that you thought was possible in me and more. Just get some pedal pumping action going in your life." The second thing I just want to leave with you very briefly is that the desert is where I come face to face with my temptation and my sin. When Jesus went into the desert, they were real temptations that he faced. And desert times, desert experiences force us to face ourselves up with the realness of ourselves. See, God doesn't want to stand on the other side of an Instagram picture of yourself. He doesn't look at our lives through a Facebook post. He doesn't look through a YouTube presentation of your life. He wants to be in your world with you. He wants the reality of who you are, warts and all, to stand in his presence. And where there is weakness, where there is failure, there is love, grace, and a covering for all of that. He has a way of taking us through those dark times so that who we really are shows up, and then we can offer all of ourselves into the presence of Almighty God. And just lastly, the desert is the place where you can learn to love God just because he's God, not because he's got milk and honey for you. I wonder if anybody remembers the arcade game when they were little, the claw game, where you would put your money in and the claw would go and you could pick a prize up. I've got a picture, you'll remember that from Toy Story, those who are familiar with Toy Story. All those little sort of alien creatures would look up and see the claw. Do you remember that? Okay. I used to play that game as a kid, and when I was very little, I was full of optimism. I'd put my money in. Well, it was my money, but I'd really take from mum and dad, and I fully expected to win. And when I didn't win the first time or the second time, it didn't seem to worry too much. Do you know, I'm now just a little bit older than 28 years old, and I've played that game. I've still never won a prize. And my optimism and my expectation has turned into cynicism, and I know they fixed that game. I know the amount of money that I've put into a claw game. I could have gone down to Argos and picked up 10 prizes worth 10 times as much for rather than just hoping I'd win it for free or for a little amount of money. Anybody experienced that? I know I have. So why do I say all that? What's going to happen in your walk with God when you get nothing that you want from God? Not the promotion, not the house, not the relationship, not even the health. And you keep putting your 50p in and you're getting nothing back. Then I find out, God, do I really love you for you? Or is it your stuff? Do I love God for God? Will I love this life he gives me, this world he's created? Or do I love him only when I get good stuff from him? Do I love life? Do I love other people? Only when I get the good stuff from God. The desert was intended by God not to be a place of punishment. It was intended to be the place where Israel learned just to simply trust in God's love like a child. You see, God gave them manna. He gave them quail, meat and bread. He gave them water from a rock. He protected them with that canopy of the cloud from the sun. It says their shoes never wore out. They never had to fight big battles. They never had to build big cities. They just had to trust him. All of that was a gift from a loving father to a nation he called his own child, his son. Just a gift. He'd guard and protect them every night. Lovely verse in Hosea says this. God is speaking. He says, but then I'll win her back once again. I'll lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her there. I'll return her vineyards to her and transform the valley of trouble into a gateway of hope. We can look at seasons like this and think, this is just a wilderness experience. This is a dry time. Where's God? But God does some of his best work of drawing loving relationship for us in desert places where there are no distractions, where there's nothing of this world to cause us to look the other way. And God says, if you're going through those desert times, I'm right here. I want to spend time with you. I want you to draw from my love. I want you to choose to be with me because of who I am, not for who you think I should be or what you think a God should look like in your world. Are we prepared to let go of some of those icons of what we think God should be and trust him for who he is? I just want to bring a challenge to the end as I conclude. I don't know why you're going through your desert experience. I don't know what it is you might be going through, but what I do know is that the Bible tells us that when God came to this earth in the form of Jesus, he didn't take the shortcut. He went on a roundabout journey to win us back to him. He didn't take the shortest route of the throne and of power. He walked through a desert. He humbled himself to become obedient to death, taking on the form of a slave, washing the disciples' feet. His final walk to his death was from the temple to the cross at Golgotha, through this winding road of great suffering. Some of you may have heard of that it's Latin in the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering and hostility, carrying the cross on his back with a mob ridiculing all the way. It was the way of sorrows for him. It was the way of suffering. That's our God. See, God walked the roundabout way so that he could draw us to him, so that when we die through him, through surrender and repentance, we can know him fully and be fully known just for who we are by him. I don't understand all about this, but if you'll go with him on the roundabout way, the way of the desert, the way of the cross, the way of surrender, the way of faith, Jesus says he will surely know one day the triumph of the resurrection and the glory of the hope of his life in you. That is a place and a way of surrender. Just before I finish, I want to leave that challenge with you. Maybe you've never made a personal commitment to Jesus, a personal sense of, actually, I want to know this Jesus, this Son of God for myself, not borrow from somebody else's experience of faith. You know, you can do that. We would love to spend some time, maybe pray with you in your situation or circumstance. And if you go to our website, www.epchurchaog.com, and on the front of that page, there's a little button, I think it's a blue button that says, I said yes. And what you're saying is that you're saying, actually, when you hit that button, it's not committing to anything. Others say, I'd like to find out more. Yes, I'd like to find out a bit more about what this belief in a loving God really looks like. And there are some great people that you can engage with on your own terms, and we'd love to spend some time. Maybe you just have a prayer request. Maybe you wouldn't call yourself a Christian, but actually, just maybe, prayer could make a difference. Why don't you press that button and just leave your prayer request? We'd love it. We'd love to just demonstrate the power of God's loving care in your world. And maybe you're going through a desert experience in your own world and you thought God had forgotten you, and you're here today and you're hearing these words, and God is shouting at you using my voice, saying, I've not forgotten. I've just taken my hands off the stabilizers of your life. I've taken the stabilizers off of your ride with me. You need to learn to just walk by faith and not by sight. And God says, I'm with you all the way. Would you keep trusting him, come what may? Well, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Bible says, cause his face to shine upon you, and may he bring you peace. Keep trusting, keep believing. See you soon.
What an incredible sermon. I'm sure that's challenged you just as it's challenged me. Now listen, remember, it's so important at times like this to stay connected. And the way you can do that is through joining a Life Connect group if you haven't got one already. And if you want to do that, just email lifeconnect@epchurchaog.com and we can get that set up for you right away. Hope you've enjoyed the service, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place. Stay blessed. Ciao.